All right, cool. Well, thank you everybody for coming today. Today is our annual ramp cultivation webinar. My name is Andrea Miller. I'm the Sustainable Forestry Program Manager at Rural Action. And Karam, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Sure. Hey, everyone. I'm Karam Shaban, Forestry Director at Rural Action. And Andrea and I are going to tag team this today. I wanted to just kick things off saying thanks again for hopping on and to give a quick plug about Rural Action. And maybe some of you are familiar with what we do. Andrea and I are both on the forestry team here at Rural Action. And so ramps, this is really at the center of what we do. A lot of work around sustainable forest management, non-timber forest products. That's other medicinal understory herbs, ginseng, golden seal. So lots of programming throughout the year. But we're only one program at Rural Action, and Rural Action has many programs. So the organization's based out of the Plains, and that's a picture of our central office there. We're an asset-based community development organization and are basically built around multiple sectors. So sustainable forestry is one, sustainable agriculture. We have a watersheds team, environmental education, sustainable energy, waste and recycling. It's a ton. And so I'd really encourage you to check out our website. And we have a calendar of events. There's like always all kinds of awesome stuff going on. And we can't even keep it straight. So if any of that other stuff speaks to you, there's lots of ways to get involved. We're also a membership-based organization. So that's another thing I just plug is the support of our members really goes a long way in supporting what we do so we can put on free events like this. So we encourage you to check that out. Forestry work, we've been doing this since the organization was founded in 1991. Our forestry program is one of our oldest programs at Rural Action. And so the educational piece is part of what we do. Workshops like this and in-person hands-on workshops. We also have a site visit program, and Andrea runs that. And if that's something that you're interested in, we come out to the property, walk the property with you, do an inventory of your forest assets, and after walking the property, work on putting together a management plan for your property based on your interests, kind of focused on non-timber forest products. And so we'll have our contact information at the end if you're in the area, and that's something you might be interested in. And are doing all kinds of other work too with the Wayne National Forest on state land, working with other nonprofit university partners across the region. So there's a lot we do, and I could talk about it for a long time, but I won't. I'm going to stop and turn it back over to Andrea to get into ramps today.
Great, thanks, Karam. So what we're going to be covering today, we're going to just do a brief introduction and overview of the ramp species, talk a little bit about the history, ramp traditions, sustainability, life cycle and development of ramps, cultivation methods, site selection for growing ramps, and then harvesting and marketing. So ramp description and characteristics. A little bit about ramps. These are a perennial herb, meaning they come back every year. They're native to the deciduous forests of eastern US and Canada. Deciduous just means trees that lose their leaves each year. So you will find ramps growing predominantly in deciduous forests. They are an allium species, so if you think of other alliums, think of plants like garlic and onions. Ramps actually have the flavor of both of those species, so kind of a cross between an onion and garlic. There are two native species, Allium tricoccum and Allium burdicii. Generally speaking, what you're going to see here in southeastern Ohio is more than likely Allium tricoccum as opposed to Allium burdicii. And we'll get into that in a little bit. But they have a long history of harvest and use by First Nations people and after European settlement in this region. And they're one of the first plants to emerge in the spring, so they can tolerate some frost and snow. And we got a little bit of snow the other day and saw some people posting pictures of ramps doing just fine with some snow cover. So in terms of their range and distribution, Allium tricoccum is pretty much all you're going to see around here. It's widely dispersed, and you can see that range map up there in the top right picture. That is the range for Allium tricoccum. Allium bardickii, you're mostly going to see that in Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, and Michigan, but you could see it elsewhere too. And there are ramp relatives across the globe in England, Japan, Iran, Wales, and Switzerland. And throughout much of the native range where we live and throughout the Appalachian region, they are over-harvested. In Canada, there are some strict regulations regarding the harvest of ramps, 5 plants per person in Canada. That's difficult to regulate, so we don't have any rules like that here, but sustainability should be at the forefront of your mind when we are looking at harvesting ramps, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. But ramps can be cultivated outside of their native range, provided that you provide ample shade and have good soil nutrient levels. The only place you probably couldn't grow ramps would be in the deep south. It's just too humid and wet, and then in the deserts because it's just too dry. In terms of ramp physical characteristics, you've probably all seen ramps, but if you haven't, their leaves are broad and flat, generally 2 to 3 leaves per plant. They're roughly 7 to 12 inches long and a couple inches wide, although I have seen ramp leaves that are wider than 2 inches, so that's not a given per plant. The leaf stalk is usually 2 to 3 inches long. It can be purple in color or white. The bulb is going to be 2 inches long and roughly 1 inch wide, with 5 concentric rings around the heart of the bulb. And then the scape, or the flower stalk, is 6 to 10 inches tall, grows from the center or the heart of the bulb, and produces a cluster of white flowers in mid to late summer. And then those flowers are going to ripen into seeds in the fall. And those seeds are hard and black, and they're kind of the shape of a BB. And then they require 18-month stratification in order for those seeds to germinate once the plant disperses those seeds. So we just wanted to go over a couple lookalikes. Lily of the Valley can look kind of similar to ramps. As you can see, those leaves there on the left, they're kind of long, they're kind of broad. And then false hellebore over there on the right. This is another one that can kind of look like ramps as it's emerging. Lily of the Valley is typically found in a garden. However, it can escape cultivation and can be found in the wild. False green hellebore, we don't really have that growing around here, but you get down into West Virginia and down in that area, you do see a lot more of it. I would say the number one thing to do would be do the smell test. If you were to see either of these plants growing out in the wild and you were to break off a leaf and you smelled it, if it doesn't have a garlic or onion smell, it's not going to be a ramp. Ramps are very highly aromatic with that garlic and onion smell. So that would be, the tall tale sign that it's not a ramp if it doesn't smell like ramps. So some new nutritional and medicinal properties. Ramps are high in vitamin C. They actually have more vitamin C than oranges. High in vitamin A, lutein, folic acid, selenium, and magnesium. And they do have medicinal properties as well. They have been used by First Nations peoples for thousands of years for colds, croup, earaches, and as a spring tonic. So again, the flavor is similar to garlic, and it has some of the same constituents as garlic, so it can be used medicinally in the same way. It doesn't have the same concentration as some of the constituents as garlic, but it could potentially be used. And it contains allicin, which is that highly sought after medicinal constituent of garlic.
All right. I'm going to briefly cover some of the history, culture, and sustainability surrounding the plant. So, there's a really deep, rich history of ramp harvesting in the Appalachian region. As Andrew pointed out, the range is pretty broad, but it's definitely an Appalachian plant. And it's been harvested for hundreds, thousands of years. So as one of the first green things to appear on the landscape, it essentially served as a spring tonic, right? Like the first sort of green thing after a long winter of eating stored food and getting greens back into the system. And then, as we had essentially in the past few hundred years, European colonization and settler communities settling across Appalachia, a lot of traditions that emerged around ramp harvesting. And so we have this picture here of ramps being prepared for a ramp festival And this is something that you can find ramp festivals all across Appalachia. They're really I think centered in West Virginia, but there's festivals that take place in Tennessee, Kentucky, New York, North Carolina, Ohio, and beyond. And they're a big deal. It's a lot of fun. You can prepare ramps in a million different ways, and you go to these festivals, and they are preparing them in a million different ways. But it's an income generating opportunity for people to get out into the woods. It's an opportunity to generate funds for social services, church organizations, community groups. So there's a kind of civic connection there. But something to keep in mind is that with events like this, you can see just on this table, it's a significant quantity of plants, and so where there's a little bit of a challenge is sort of balancing the cultural benefits of this type of tradition against the sustainability of harvesting this many plants. And this is a big kind of part of why we're putting on events like this, and we'll get into more of sustainability and harvesting and things like that. Yeah, more ramp festivals. You can't not post this picture of this guy. I don't recommend eating ramps like this. Not very fun. Sort of takes some of the fun out of it, I think. But this guy's having a good time. Here are some of the different ramp festivals that exist across the region. And you can see, this ramp festival, the Cosby Ramp Festival in Tennessee, 30,000 visitors. It's been going since 1954. So it's a significant tradition, and a lot that's really great that comes along with that. And I mentioned West Virginia is kind of the epicenter, 25 different festivals in that state alone each year. So it's significant. Like I mentioned, a challenge that comes along with this is, thinking about the sustainability of these plants. And ramps are a long-lived perennial species, and like most of our perennial understory plants, have a very slow growth habit and take a long time to reach maturity, to reproduce. And so when you're harvesting as many plants as get harvested across the region, just for these festivals alone, we're not talking about the other types of harvesting that are taking place, there are definitely some concerns. There's the ramp festivals, but increasingly, and I'm sure that some of you on this call have seen, this sort of surge in interest in local restaurants, in having foraged foods, and ramps are a big one. And every year we get at least one call from a magazine writer, a food writer that's doing a seasonal article on ramps, and we always feel a little torn about that. It's like great to have the opportunity to share information about this regionally significant plant and talk about the sustainability, but you also worry that this interest is resulting in larger and larger harvests. In this case of one business in West Virginia selling 25,000 pounds of ramps, it's 2.5 million plants. We're estimating that between 10 and 15 million plants are harvested each year. So these are really significant quantities of a plant that is not being replenished at that rate each year.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about habitat and growing site conditions. So like I mentioned earlier, ramps can be found in deciduous forests. This would be their ideal habitat. However, if you're growing them in raised beds or you're growing them along a forested edge, you can provide artificial shade if you need to. Generally speaking, ramps are going to prefer the north, northeast, and east-facing aspects of a hillside. This isn't always 100% true, but generally speaking, that's where you're going to find them. You might be able to find them on a westerly facing slope, more at the base of the slope or at the toe slope region, where that side of the slope is being influenced by the adjacent hillside. But generally speaking, north, northeast, east facing aspects, they do really well under 50 to 80% shade, and they like moist yet well-drained soils. I have seen ramps in areas where water can kind of come up and coagulate, but it recedes very rapidly. That could be fine, but generally speaking, they're going to want the soil to be well-drained because they don't want their feet wet all the time. And the soil is going to need to be high in calcium, roughly 2,500 to 5,000 pounds per acre, with a slightly acidic pH of 4.9 to 5.5. So all of the NTFP species that we talk about, ramps, ginseng, golden seal, all of these plants can be found growing with what we call companion plants, or plants that like to be grown with them. So some companion trees that you could look for when you're out looking for ramps, or maybe you're on your property and you want to grow ramps, but you're not sure if you have suitable habitat. There are companion trees you can look for. So sugar maple, tulip poplar, beech, basswood, birch, and pawpaw. These are all commonly grown alongside ramps. You'll see them growing naturally together. Some companion herbs that you might see growing alongside ramps: trillium, ginseng, bloodroot, blue cohosh, maidenhair fern. Some others that I see a lot are golden seal and maybe wood poppy. So here's just a picture of good ramp habitat. You can't really tell what way these slopes are facing, but that's fine because you've got this toe slope region here, kind of right there at the base of the hill next to the stream. This area is going to accumulate organic matter, which ramps really like, and it's going to accumulate moisture. So yeah, this is beautiful ramp habitat. It makes me want to get outside here soon, even though it's pretty rainy today. In terms of leaf litter, a key component of a good growing site, leaf litter, it matters a lot actually, because the leaf litter on the ground is going to tell you what the overstory conditions are, right? So we talked about some of those botanical indicator plants. Ramps are often growing under a deciduous canopy of hardwood trees, specifically tulip poplar and sugar maple. And sugar maple leaves are about 1.75% calcium by dry weight. And so when you think about that leaf litter breaking down each year and providing calcium and organic matter into the soil, you're going to have a high nutrient turnover each year just from your leaf litter alone. And these plants are going to utilize those minerals. So when you're thinking about your leaf litter, it's going to be providing organic matter. It's going to be providing the nutrients from the decomposition, moisture retention to help keep that soil moisture, insulation to keep the ground a little bit protected, and then weed suppression as well. There's a lot of things that can't grow up through the leaf litter. And your leaf litter is also key for seed germination and survival. For example, if you are in a really oaky site, oak leaves are really high in tannins. They're very tannic, and if you ever squeeze those between your hands, they often don't break apart very easily. Or if you're out hiking in the woods in an oak-dominated area, and year round, you're just going to see those oak leaves on the forest floor. They don't deteriorate very quickly. And so seeds, especially some of these forest botanicals like ginseng seeds and ramp seeds, they have a hard time germinating and breaking up through those tannic leaves. So they want to be protected, but they also want to actually be able to germinate. And leaves from tulip poplar, sugar maple, basswood, trees like that, the seeds have a better time being able to germinate up through those leaves. So never do these things. Don't plant under evergreens. These soils are typically too dry. Pine needles can also tend to acidify the soil. So those typically are not good growing sites. A windswept location, again, it's just going to be too dry. You don't want to plant seeds right out directly in the sun. Again, that 50 to 80% sweet spot of shade, that's what ramps like. And then you don't want to plant in a hot or a dry location, because again, you want the soil to be moist, you want it to have organic matter, and then you don't want it to be too hot because your plants will dry up.
Alrighty. We're going to get into ecology, growth, life cycle of this very interesting native botanical. So I mentioned earlier that ramps are a perennial species, meaning that they come back year after year, and they're slow growing. Most people on this call probably know, like, one of the really great and distinct things about ramps is how early they emerge. I mentioned that spring tonic, the first thing to come up often, one of the first things. And we're seeing some come up now in March. So the plants emerge, and their growth strategy is to take advantage of all of the sunlight available on the forest floor before any of the trees have leafed out. And so they emerge in March and are doing a lot of their growth throughout the month of April, and can put on as much as a half inch of growth onto their leaves per day. So pretty significant growth happening. And what they're doing, ramps have that distinctive bulb at the end, right? That's a storage organ. That's where they're holding their nutrition and their that they're going to use, right, to put out their leaves. And so over the winter, that bulb is actually at a larger size. It's using that energy up. The bulb shrinks throughout the season as it's investing energy in its leaves. And then as it photosynthesizes, the bulb begins to swell again. So we'll talk about that a little later, but the plant is going through, these seasonal fluctuations. So by mid-April, the plant is fully leafed out and is at, what we'll call a harvestable size. A lot of people feel that this is the time in the life cycle where the flavor is the best. And that's probably true. There's some considerations around sustainability. And so, here we are fully developed in May. Like I mentioned, the bulb of the plant is actually at its smallest size when the leaves have just kind of reached their peak size, right? And then they've got the leaves out, they're photosynthesizing, and the ramp is actually going to grow in size into May. And then it's a quick turnaround. You'll see that, definitely in May often, and definitely by June, the leaves are turning yellow, they're dying back. And you'll start to see the flower stalk emerging as the plant moves into its next life cycle phase. So that flower stalk emerges and the leaves die back, and then that stalk is going to open up and typically will bloom July to August. You can see it's got these small white flowers being pollinated by small sweat bees, in some cases ants, but small insects. Also has the ability to self-fertilize. You won't see this. So if you're seeing a flower stalk, that's a mature plant, a reproductively mature plant. And that is telling you that that plant is, at least 6 years old. So I mentioned slow growing, and this gets back to some of the conservation concerns. It takes quite a while for a plant to reach reproductive maturity. And actually, another thing I'll just note on the reproductive maturity front is that you'll see ramps will often have a mature, fully developed ramp. We'll often have 2 or 3 of those leaves coming off of the center of the plant, right? And that's an indication that it's reproductive, that you've got those 2 leaves. So you get the flowers in July. Oh, sorry, Andrea, let me say a little more here. After it flowers, right, it'll move into this next this picture here where you've got those sort of green, unripe seed pods. And then throughout that season, right into the fall, you'll get these ripening seeds. Those are the black BBs. They're really pretty tough. And in a lot of cases, like when you're not in ramp, if it's not leaf out season, you can go looking, and if you start looking around, you'll see that these really distinctive seed stalks are all over the place. And that's a good way. You can still do ramp habitat identification outside of early spring. So a bit on the seed biology. Like many forest understory species, ramp seeds have to undergo it's called a double dormancy. Essentially, from the time that seed ripens on the flower stalk and hits the ground, it actually needs to go through 2 seasons before it germinates. And this is a pretty common strategy that you'll see in understory plants. And we think it's evolved to basically as a response to the extreme variability of growing in a forest understory and having the ability to kind of like just hang tight, wait, get a good mulch of leaf litter over top of you, and germinate when conditions are right. So if you're collecting seeds, you can either go ahead and just plant those immediately. You just have to keep this in mind that you shouldn't expect to see any of those seeds germinating for 2 seasons. So if you go and plant them in the fall, they're not going to come up the following spring. You're going to have to wait a whole additional season, and then that next spring is when the seeds would germinate. And you can also store the seeds for that duration of time in a cool, dark place, and see them through to that second season, and then you could plant them the second fall, and they would come up in the spring. We do find that collecting and planting seeds directly into the ground improves survival. Like you can see, basically these are, for the most part, these seeds are gravity dispersed, right? So they're falling off that seed stock, and maybe they're rolling a little bit if they're on a hillside, but they aren't usually going very far. So by going and collecting those seeds and maybe broadcasting them across your hillside, you're going to help disperse those seeds more widely and get better germination rates. I talked about this 18-month stratification. Essentially that seed needs to go through the experience of multiple temperature fluctuations. So like this is something that you can actually recreate in like a controlled environment, and researchers do that. You just change the temperature for a certain amount of time, and that's what the seed is actually responding to. But it's an interesting evolutionary adaptation. And so this picture here shows what ramp seedlings look like in the first year. And it can be kind of difficult to identify ramps in the first year because, as you can see, it doesn't have the double leaf. So, and they're very small and much more narrow than they'll be even in their next year of growth. So it can just look like grass. You kind of have to have a discerning eye, or know that you put seeds down there to know that you're looking at ramp seedlings. So even though ramps leaves die back after, in May and June, there's a lot that's happening underground. And so I mentioned that, ramps really, like, their strategy is to throw their leaves out when there's a ton of sun available in the understory. A lot of other understory plants are sitting there throughout the summer in like a mostly shaded environment, trying to just catch rays of sun that come through the leaves when they can. Ramps are just feasting for a short amount of time, and then they're taking that energy and they're putting it into the bulb, which is, like I said, the energy storage organ of that plant. And so as you get into the fall, the plant is going through this process in November, December of actually shedding the outer layers of the bulb. And, it's in the onion family and has layers just like any onion does. And that's something you can see when you harvest a ramp. So it's shedding those outer layers. And in the process, the flower stalk is being moved throughout that growth and development period. In January, you've got a new heart developing at the center of the bulb. And that bulb is fluctuating in size pretty significantly as the plant is moving energy around. And as you get into February, the energy is again moving. The plant's getting ready to put new leaves out. And so, you're seeing major. So one thing I wanted to point out with ramps is that it's kind of interesting. If you go to an area where there are ramps in the winter months and you pull back the leaf litter, you'll actually be able to see a portion of that ramp is above ground, which is sort of unique for a perennial understory plant. And this is not something we recommend, but sometimes people will go out and harvest ramps in the winter, and you'll hear them referred to as bullet ramps. It's just the bulb. Not something we recommend doing. But in February, you are at a point where those ramps can be harvested and transplanted. So, I say we don't recommend it. We don't recommend harvesting them then for consumption. But if you're interested in transplanting ramps from one location to another, February is the time to do it before it's really leafed out. The plants are gathering their forces, and it's a good time to get them in the ground in a new place and let them put their leaves out. So ramps are a cool plant for a lot of reasons. One of those reasons is that they are able to reproduce vegetatively or clonally or asexually. And so it may take a plant 6 or 7 years to reach sexual maturity. And that's the point where they're putting out flower, producing seeds. But what ramps can do earlier than that, even, is they can clonally reproduce. And so that's where you have one bulb that divides and turns into 2 bulbs. And then that process can repeat. And I would argue that ramps actually are spreading within a population clonally through this method faster and more significantly than they are able to expand through sexual reproduction. And so you can see this picture here of just like a dense carpet of ramps, and I'm sure that many of us have seen this. And this is by and large a product of that clonal reproduction, where that population is basically filling in. Yeah, you can go to the next slide, Andrea. So let's get into some of the cultivation aspects we've been touching on. You know, the supply chain of ramps, and for things like the ramp festivals, for providing ramps to restaurants, in the foraged food movement, a lot of that is coming from collection of ramps from wild populations. And what we really are here to promote, and the work that we do at Rural Action, is based around intentional cultivation of understory herbs. And we'll call this forest farming. You'll hear us refer to workshops on forest farming and working with forest farmers. And that's all based around this intentional cultivation. And so ramps are a plant that can be cultivated. And, we definitely are working with folks that are doing this. In many cases, we're working with people who have an existing ramp population on their property. And what there really is a great opportunity to do with ramps is to steward that wild population in a way where you are harvesting, but you're also actively tending that population. You're replanting the seeds, right? That you're collecting seeds, you're establishing new populations on your property. Another thing that is relatively easy to do is to go in and find reproductive adult plants that have clonally reproduced, where you've got essentially 2 bulbs that have, one bulb that's divided into 2 and they're right next to each other. You can go and essentially pull them apart, take one of those plants and, harvest that to sell or to consume, or you can go and replant that bulb in another location. And so this kind of active tending of existing ramp populations is a common way that we're working with people to move into that cultivation mentality. We also sell ramps, and our ramp sale recently ended. We do it every year. We're selling bulbs. But if you don't have any ramps on your property, that's a way to get started. And through this process of tending that I'm talking about, it's a slow growing plant. It takes time, but with a little patience, you can begin to create your own ramp patch. And we're promoting this in part because a ramp is a ramp. And if you're gonna, going through that extra effort to cultivate this non-timber forest product is, provides an opportunity to access those same markets that we're talking about, but to do that in a sustainable way. So you're generating income, you're nurturing this wild plant on your property, and it's a win-win. So there's various ways to cultivate ramps, and we'll get into this a little bit talking about forest farming, but like I mentioned, you may just be stewarding a wild plant population, and that's great. If you have that wild resource in your property, that's a great asset and something you can work with. If you don't have ramps on your property, you can introduce them, like buy some bulbs from us or some seed online. You can buy ramp seed online, and you can just kind of put them out into suitable ramp habitat. Andrea was talking about the kinds of sites that tend to be good for ramps, northeast facing hillsides, where, if there's a stream at the base of the hillside, that's a great sign that tells you there's water present on that site, and ramps definitely like having access to soil moisture. And if you find suitable ramp habitat, you can buy some bulbs from us, basically dig a hole, plop them in the ground, and they'll do their thing. That's where they want to be. Now, if you, for whatever reason, let's say you don't have a northeast facing slope, ramps will respond to a cultivation approach that's a little closer to something like gardening. And that's this picture down here, the lower picture. Somebody's actually built a raised bed, put ramps into that spot. It looks like this is happening in a forest. Ramps still need a degree of shade. And so you're still utilizing the natural shade of a forest environment, but let's say it's maybe a little hotter, a little drier. There's opportunities to be a little more, to baby those plants a little more, maybe is a way of saying it. And it's still all very low tech. You can do this if you've got a couple hands, a couple rakes, maybe pruners to clear out your forest area, so you can put a raised bed or whatever you need. But it's all pretty low tech and accessible. Forest farming. Okay, so we talked about this, and what I wanted to convey, which I think I've already spoken to a little bit, is that forest farming is sort of an umbrella term that encompasses various degrees of intensity. And so wild harvesting, tending to wild plants, well, that you could think of that as like on one end of the spectrum in terms of intensity, very low intensity. You're replanting seeds when you find them. Maybe you're subdividing some bulbs and expanding the ramp population around the edges, but you're basically working with wild plants. Can click to the next one. At the next level of intensity, wild simulated, that's where you're actually going and putting plants into a wild environment, but otherwise it's very hands-off. There's another process, I referred to it as forest gardening. Sometimes you'll hear it in the forest farming world as referred to as woods grown ramps or woods grown ginseng. In this case, this is a picture of ginseng. And this picture, what's going on here, like these are all ginseng plants growing at ramps might grow this way. Ginseng does not typically grow this way. And so in a woods grown approach, people, will actually go into a forest understory and till up the soil, build raised beds. So you're utilizing the natural shade of that forest environment. But it's a much more hands-on, closer to gardening, or conventional, like, crop farming, specialty crop farming. And then, field cultivation, this is not really relevant to ramps. Again, this is ginseng, but it just goes to show that these forest understory plants can be propagated and managed in a wide variety of settings. And as a forest farmer or aspiring forest farmer, really, if you're interested in cultivating ramps, it's deciding what degree of intensity is right for you, because there's trade-offs in terms of time, labor, and productivity. What we tend to promote is wild simulated production, whether it's ginseng, it's ramps. And the reason that we do that is that it provides the most favorable trade-offs in terms of the labor inputs and the cost inputs to the value that you can get out of those plants in your system. And that's because the labor and costs are relatively low. You're purchasing the plants and you're sticking them in the ground and you're letting them grow in a way that is natural for the plant. These are all native species that are part of our forest ecosystems. In many cases, the forests in our region are second growth forests that were cleared for agriculture, 100 years ago and have grown back up. And we're at a point now where most of the forests in our region are mature, closed canopy forests, but they're second growth forests. And so in that process of conversion to agriculture, The species that were lost and have had the hardest time coming back tend to be our understory herb species. And think about going back to the seed biology for ramps and the way that those seeds just kind of drop, mostly gravity dispersed. And you think about a forest that regrew after it was in agriculture for 50, 80, 100 years. These plants have a hard time getting back onto the landscape. So one of the things that we like to promote with wild simulated forest farming is you're actually acting as a disperser of that plant into an environment that it naturally wants to be in. And so if you go and you end up harvesting 80% of those plants, well, you left 20% behind in their natural habitat, and you're part, we refer to this as conservation through cultivation. By forest farming, you're actually part of restoring populations of these plants on the landscape. So as far as actually planting the bulbs, I'm making it sound simple. It is pretty simple, but essentially when you purchase the bulbs, let's say from Rural Action in February or March, you're just going to mostly get, you can see this picture down below. This is what the ramps are going to look like. It's the bulb and just the very beginning of the leaves emerging. So it'll look kind of like, as opposed to a real tight round bulb, it's going to be elongated. And it's ready to put its leaf up and it's ready to be transplanted. So basically, if you've got something like a mattock, that's great. I've just used a stick, to make a little hole. You don't have to get fancy about this, but you want to make a hole around three inches deep. And you can see that along with the bulb, you've got all these fine fibrous roots. So that's important. You want those roots to be intact. That's the nutrient uptake system for the bulb. And you're shocking of any plant that's being transplanted, there's a little bit of a shock to the system. And so those fine roots are the way that plant is going to be able to hit the ground running, getting nutrients into the system. So you want those fine roots to stay intact. You want to dig a big enough hole that you can put those roots, orient them so that they're all facing down. You don't want those roots curling back up because you've not dug a deep enough hole. And you want to give that plant all of the advantages that you can give it. And then you want to put, basically fill in. I mentioned that ramps are kind of unique in that they actually, throughout the winter, the tips of the bulb can be seen right above the soil surface. So you're trying to replicate that in this picture. This above picture shows how much of the plant you want to leave above the soil surface so that its leaf can just leaf out, start photosynthesizing. And we recommend, spacing individual plants 6 to 8 inches apart, maybe as much as 2 to 3 feet. Ramps actually over time have a tendency to, if anything, overcrowd. And when you see those dense populations of ramps, they have a tendency, because the way that the plants subdivide and they drop the seeds right on top of themselves, where you get these dense clumps of ramps. And what will eventually happen is that you'll get moisture retention between individual bulbs and eventually disease as a result of that. And something that gets referred to as clump death is like a patch of ramps that they were too dense. There's some localized disease, and you get like the die off of maybe an 8-inch radius area of ramps that'll die, which is one reason why actively tending populations, subdividing roots, spreading them out, you're actually giving the plant room to grow and not suffer from this clump death. So wider spacing is good because the plant is going to make its way inward. And once you put those plants in the ground, throwing leaf litter back on top serves as a mulch. It holds in moisture, hides the plants from predation or whatever else. And so just throwing those leaves back on top, and it's like you were never there. You get some ramps that come up in the spring. Seeds, yeah, it's pretty straightforward. They're really easy, kind of fun to collect. One thing that I've seen is a good approach is to take essentially like a plastic sandwich bag, put it over the leaf head, and then just kind of crinkle things up, and the seeds will fall into the sandwich bag. It's kind of painstaking if you're going to pick one seed off at a time. And once you have those seeds, you can just broadcast those seeds. So, we would, similar to planting bulbs, you could go through with the rake back the leaf litter, maybe scuff up the soil a little bit. We call that scarifying the soil. You're basically just increasing physical contact between the seed and the soil, which is a good thing. And just kind of broadcast them and roughly you could be thinking 7 to 10 seeds a square foot. Not all your seeds are going to germinate. So you don't need to be thinking, well, each seed is one plant and I want each plant to be 6 inches apart. It doesn't have to be that scientific. You can just broadcast them, cover back with leaves, walk over the leaves a little bit, compact the soil down, and then you're done. So, a consideration, if you're interested in forest farming ramps or tending a wild population of ramps, is to think about, well, how can I sustain perpetual productivity on this site so that I'm always harvesting, but I'm never over harvesting, and I'm not going to suddenly, arrive one season to no ramps in my ramp patch. And they've tried to do research on this, what is truly a sustainable harvest level within a given population of ramps. And they've basically been conflicting results in studies that have looked at this. So one commonly cited study basically said, in a given year, don't harvest more than 10% of a ramp patch. But subsequent follow-on studies have found that that's actually still an unsustainable harvest level, and that rather than thinking about harvesting a percentage of the total ramp patch, thinking about maintaining an overall population level based on the total size. So I've heard that you're actually trying to maintain 90% of the original population. So, basically, like, just being sensitive to the fact these are slow growing plants, replanting seed, which increases that germination rates on the seed, subdividing bulbs, especially targeting those dense clumps where you've got multiple bulbs that are really packed in tight. You can get in there, dig them up, subdivide them, plant on the edge of your population. Those are ways that you can just ensure that population is going to grow as fast as possible and that you'll be able to harvest year after year. And just being sensitive to the fact that it's easy to over harvest, and just watching that you're not hitting one population too hard. And then I think I saw a question. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, but about leaf harvest. And that's absolutely something we promote. It may be in our presentation here later. I think it is, but essentially, yes, you can just harvest leaves as opposed to harvesting the entire plant and digging up the bulb. And if you're harvesting from a mature plant that has 2 or 3 leaves, and you just basically cut one leaf, you're still leaving behind plant material for that plant to use to photosynthesize in that year. And we definitely recommend that. There's been research that shows that harvesting a single leaf has a very minimal impact on that plant's ability to even grow in that year. So it's a really sustainable way to still enjoy ramps without having to harvest the entire plant. And let's see, I'm going to keep going. I'll get to questions at the end. Yeah, pest disease maintenance. Ramps are relatively hardy overall. And there aren't too many things that prey on ramps, that strong flavor that humans like, or most humans like, some humans like. Most predators of the plant tend to not like. In fact, it's sort of a defense mechanism. But you will get deer and turkey that will browse young leaves. It's not a huge issue, but it does happen. Turkey scratch. There are some diseases that affect the plant. This is septoria leaf spot. In most cases, this isn't like a lethal thing. It's more like aesthetic, and maybe it makes the plant a little unappetizing. The clump death that I mentioned, that's actually probably worse than any disease, or predation. The ramps are their own worst enemy, and that's where you can go in and harvest those clumps and thin them out. But always good to just keep an eye on these kinds of things. Yeah. Well, I said ramps are their own worst enemy, but probably, humans are the biggest threat. Definitely humans are the biggest threat to ramps. And so there's overharvesting, but there's also poaching. And people will go into federal land, state land where you're not allowed to legally harvest and dig ramps up. It's happening all the time, around the Athens area where we are. So it's a problem. And it's all the more reason that, it's good to keep these sustainability things in mind.
Cool. So the last couple things we're going to talk about are harvesting and marketing, but we'll get into harvesting here first. So like Karen mentioned, generally speaking, the best time to harvest is going to be mid-April to mid-May. This is when the bulbs have their peak flavor. The bulb does harden and tend to lose some flavor after mid-May. So that mid-May is kind of that sweet spot. Like we talked about clump death, you want to target thicker clumps because generally speaking, the thicker that clump gets, the more it runs the risk of clump death or dealing with disease. So it's better to target clumps. And then if you are growing your own ramps and you're transplanting them, let's say you bought some ramps bulbs from us this year, you wouldn't want to harvest those bulbs until after probably 4 to 6 years, just to give them some time to grow and then reproduce asexually through the bulb. If you're growing from seed, you want to wait until after 7 years of growth. And you can harvest the whole plant for market if you want, or you could harvest just the leaves like we were just talking about. I personally think that the leaves have just as much, if not more flavor than the bulbs. So I never harvest bulbs. I only harvest leaves. And if the plant has only 1 leaf, you wouldn't want to harvest that. If the plant has 2 leaves, you could harvest 1. If the plant has 3 leaves, I still generally only harvest 1. And you can do this once the leaves get a little bit bigger, late March, early April. It seems like things are really early this year. So the time can be variable depending on the season, but I would say late March to early April would be peak leaf harvesting time. And you can harvest leaves for personal use, or you can use leaves in value-added products as well. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So some harvesting tips. You want to harvest in the early morning. This will avoid the leaves from wilting from the sun. Again, these are the first things to leaf out in the spring. So oftentimes when the leaves are fully grown out, there isn't a whole lot of leaf on the overstory trees. So the leaves can be very susceptible to wilting and they can be susceptible to some sun damage. So you want to do it early in the morning. When you harvest, you're going to want to hold the stalk. You don't want to bruise the leaves. And this is if you're selling them. So if you're just, harvesting these for yourself for personal use, the cosmetic look of the plant is not a huge deal. But if you're harvesting a marketable product that you want to take to sell to people, you want it to look good. You don't want it to look wilted. You don't want there to be bruising. You don't want the leaves to be damaged. You want it to look good. So when you harvest, you want to hold the stalk to avoid bruising the leaves, and you want to dig around the bulb, around the outer edge of that clump, because you don't want to damage the bulb. And Karen's going to talk about this slide real quick.
Yeah, so I mentioned this earlier, and just about the way that the over the course of a season, an individual ramp will change its size pretty significantly. And so this is we've had this slide for a little while, but this researcher, Eric Burkhart, who's at Penn State University, just published a new paper looking specifically at this the data around the change in size of individual ramp plants throughout the season. And so what he found is that at the beginning, you can basically, like, let's say you look at looking at this graph, it's basically showing different dates and the number of ramps per pound. And you can see that that number changes throughout the season. And so essentially, like April, when the ramp is putting out its leaves and pushing most of its energy into growing leaves, that ramp bulb is at its smallest size. And so it takes more ramps per pound. It takes more ramps to reach a pound. And as the plant is typically sold by the pound, if you're harvesting ramps in mid-April, you're going to have to harvest more ramps to reach the same number of pounds to get paid the same amount. And so this research is basically suggesting that as a sustainability measure, if you delay harvesting ramps from that early April to say early May, when the ramp has had time to photosynthesize, to put on more size, you could harvest fewer ramps to reach the same number of pounds, get paid the same amount. And it's just taking some of that pressure off the ramp populations. So it's just something to keep in mind when you're harvesting, if you are thinking in terms of yield and you're not just doing this for your own personal consumption, that by waiting a little bit longer, you can actually do a little less work, dig up fewer plants, keep more of that population intact, and get the same quantity, and therefore get paid the same amount. So
cool, thanks. So washing and post-harvest handling, again, when you're thinking about a marketable product, you want it to look really good. So when you're cleaning your ramps, you don't want to spray the leaves with a jet. You want to spray them with like a gentle setting when you're cleaning them. That way you don't damage the leaves. The leaves are pretty hardy, but you know, if you hit them with a hard stream of water, it can damage them. So it's easiest to use a washing rack. You could just get an old screen from the Habitat for Humanity store. That's what I have when I'm cleaning all my herbs and all my plants that I harvest from my garden. I just lay them on top of a screen and I hose them off. Or you can use a utility sink and soak them first when you have smaller quantities. So again, don't spray the leaves with a jet. It's easiest if you get a little screen and just gently wash off the dirt. You want to trim the roots, but you don't want to remove all of the roots completely. So if you look at that picture down there in the bottom right, it's good to leave some of those fibrous roots. If you trim those roots too short, you run the risk of cutting into the bulb, and that's not what you want to do. You want that bulb to be perfectly intact. So those down there in the bottom, that's not what you want it to look like. They've got the top stalk for the leaves cut off, that one in the middle, the bulb's kind of cut in half, and that one on the right, it's kind of got the top cut off as well. You want them to remain perfectly intact. And then in order to keep them fresh, you just want to refrigerate them after you've harvested them and rinse them off immediately. So in terms of marketing, there's roughly 75 plants per pound of ramps, give or take. And the current market prices are anywhere from $7 to $28 a pound. However, that totally depends on where you're selling the ramps. So farmers markets, roadside stands. We talked a lot about ramp festivals, dinners, and then direct to restaurants. So it really just depends on where you're selling the ramps at. And it also depends the region in which you're selling your ramps to. There are huge opportunities for urban markets to sell ramps to larger, or not necessarily larger scale, but to restaurants in larger cities outside of the Appalachian region, but you do have to ship them there. So there's an ecological footprint associated with that. And then, you know, there's also the idea of, should we even be selling ramps to regions outside of this area, because it does potentially put more pressure on wild populations for people to then go out and begin foraging ramps unsustainably. So just a lot to think about when you're thinking about marketing your ramps, but there's a lot of different value-added products that you can make. Again, you can utilize the leaves, or you can use the whole plant, or you could use just the bulbs. You can make ramp pasta, crackers, pesto, cheeses. Integration Acres, they make a lot of ramp products and they're all really good. There's also ramp gravy mixes, pickled ramps. I really love pickled ramps. That's one of my favorite ways to consume ramps. But in addition to making products that you can eat, there's also an opportunity for planting stock markets. So like we talked about, these plants take a really long time to regenerate themselves, and the rate at which they're being harvested, not just from the wild, but even, you know, from private property, it's difficult for ramps to replace themselves in a short amount of time. So you could potentially tap into the market of planting stock, which is you're harvesting ramp bulbs to sell to other people to plant so that they can grow ramps, or you're harvesting seeds to sell to other people so that they can plant ramps by way of seed. So there's really a lot of different ways you could market your ramps and utilize the plant to generate some supplemental income. So just some market concerns and opportunities. There are price competitions from wild harvest versus wild simulated or wild produced. Wild harvested ramps are probably going to be a little bit cheaper. They're going to be a little bit cheaper than ramps that are being cultivated, because you're actually out there farming the ramps, and you know, you have labor inputs that you have to take into consideration when you're selling your ramps. but there is an opportunity to create a sustainable brand. For example, you can market your ramps that they've been sustainably cultivated versus wild harvested, excuse me. So, you can really just create your branding. United Plant Savers also has what's called the Forest Grown Verified program. And that's basically a third-party verification system that, let's say you're growing ramps and you want to sell them on the market. The FGV program will come out, make sure you're keeping records, make sure that what you're actually growing are ramps, and you'll get an FGV label that you can use on your product. And what you can then say to your customer is, oh, this is FGV certified. It's been verified by a third-party system that's basically saying, I'm doing this in a sustainable manner. I'm not going out and wild harvesting these ramps. I'm actually growing them. And people will pay more money for that because people do care about the sustainability of this at-risk species. So again, this can be a selling point. And then it always comes down to education too. Some people don't know what ramps are, or they hear about ramps and they don't really know anything about the sustainability of the ramp. So if you are selling ramps and you come across someone that doesn't know what a ramp is or doesn't have a lot of knowledge around the sustainability, it's really important for you to educate them about the sustainability of the species. So lastly, just wanted to go over some resources. This third resource down here on the bottom, Scott Pearson's and Janine Davis, Growing and Marketing Ginseng, Golden Seal, and Other Woodland Medicinals. This is probably like the holy grail of forest farming book. So if this forest farming is something that you're interested in, I would highly recommend looking into purchasing that book down there on the bottom by Scott Pearson's and Janine Davis. Another really great literary work, Having Your Ramps and Eating Them Too. And then there's some publications from NC State regarding ramps, lots of really, really great information there. And then if you have any additional questions after we take questions at the end of the presentation, you are welcome to email Karam or myself. We also have our Rural Action website. There are tons of fact sheets and resources there for growing all non-timber forest products. So not just ramps, but ginseng, golden seal, black cohosh, bloodroot. We have some videos there as well. And then we also have a literary work called the Forest Farmer's Handbook. This is a book that Rural Action and United Plant Savers wrote a few years ago. It covers bloodroot, golden seal, ramps, American ginseng, black cohosh. And then we just recently added an updated chapter of Solomon seal. So it has cultivation guides for all of those 6 species I just mentioned. And then there's also the Forest Farming YouTube channel. Tons of really great videos there. A lot of them are hands-on, which are kind of showing you in practice a lot of what we talked about today. And then I just like this picture because it's got ramps next to some fiddleheads next to some Italian broccoli. So there is a place for ramps in the grocery store, provided that, we're sustainable about how we do it. And yeah, that's it. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we can take questions. I haven't been monitoring the chat because I've been having my screen shared, but Karam, I guess we could just probably start going through the chat. And then if anybody feels like unmuting themselves or turning off their camera, you're welcome to do that, or you can just type your questions in the chat.
Well, I can hear. Why don't I read off some of these chat questions and then we can take a crack at them. So this first one from Carol was a question about stilt grass invading where I plant my ramps. The ramps are in the woods on a slope, so I cannot mow the stilt grass. What do you think about that, Andrea? Because we had that with ginseng grower recently.
Yeah, we see that a lot. Unfortunately, stilt grass can thrive in some of the same locations where a lot of these high value NTFPs grow. I see it all the time, unfortunately. Areas that never had stilt grass before suddenly are just becoming overrun with stilt grass. It's challenging. I personally hate herbicide and don't really necessarily like recommending that, but I've talked to a few experts that work for the ODNR and Pheasants Forever and some other landowners who have had some of the same issue. They've recommended using 0.5% of glyphosate in your plantings. So like 0.05% of whatever concentration or size container you're using. And that will kill the stilt grass. It doesn't tend to kill any of the other nearby plants, doesn't linger in the soil very long. And so native plants can fill the niche pretty quickly. I really hate that. I really, really do. But unfortunately, Stillgrass keeps me up at night. And with each passing year, Karen talked about site visits that we do. You know, I run those. It just gets worse and worse every year. And I hear landowner after landowner say the exact same thing to me. There was never any stillgrass here, and now it's here. And so it's just something we're going to have to deal with. I see it pretty much on every property. You can hand pull it. You will have to stay on top of it. The seeds can linger in the seed bank for up to probably like 5 years, I think. Karen, is that right? Somewhere around there. So you really have to stay on top of it. The seeds can also be spread by animals, so that can be problematic. If you've got it on trails that you're running ATVs on, it can get caught in the undercarriage, and then it's also transported to other locations on your property. It's just really difficult to control. I could talk forever about stillgrass, but pulling it would be great. Your best bet if you don't want to use a very, very, very low concentration of glyphosate. Karen, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it is a tough one. You know, we've heard that a strategy that can work is like just using a weed whacker to knock it down before it goes to seed late summer, and to just do that a couple years in a row, and eventually like you can kind of to wear it down. And I mean, weed whacking on a hill, that doesn't sound so great. The other thing is, you know, at that time ramps would have died back, so you would have a window. But yeah, it's just hard. I think it's like you would have to do it by hand, or you'd have to use herbicide, and those are both are trade-offs. So okay, Anna asked about we have a lot of red and white cedars here in southern Adams County. Will these trees affect ramp growth like pines? And I did want to, I have a picture that I'm just going to do this. This is hilarious, but I don't know if you can see this. But basically those are ramps growing under pine. And I wanted to show this because like everything we, you know, talk about, it's like, there's always exceptions. In the case of this picture, I think that this was an area that has actually had pretty fertile soil. The hardwood trees had been cut down. The pines had grown up as the first thing to move back into that area. But, you know, over time, that area was probably going to turn back into a hardwood site. So ramps are growing there. But generally, the thing is with things like pine, but also, you know, cedar, is the fact that those trees are there. It's telling you something about the underlying soil conditions. And a lot of our conifer species, it's kind of a cycle where they actually acidify the soil over time. But at the same time, you're more likely to find them growing in soil that's already acidic. So I would just say, as a general rule of thumb, if you're in an area that has conifers instead of, meaning pine trees, just needled evergreen species, it's probably telling you that the soil there is just not fertile enough for something like a ramp to thrive. And so I just wouldn't say, it's just not your first. If you feel adventurous and you want to plant a couple ramps underneath them and see what happens, go for it. Because like that picture shows, it might work, but it probably won't. So it should not be your first site, I would say. Aaliyah asked, how close do you plant the bulbs? We did talk about that. 6 to 8 inches apart, I think is a good recommendation, or as far as 2 to 3 feet. It's sort of up to you. I wouldn't plant much closer. You could, but those plants will fill themselves in. Are any bulbs still available? Andrea, are any bulbs still available?
I don't think so. Yeah,
No.
Chris has the tally, but I'm pretty sure we're not in the
Sold out.
negative. We're not in the negative, but we don't
Almost.
have any. Yeah.
They sold out really fast this year and last year. So we're working next year to just get more, but it's a challenge to source them. So unfortunately, yeah, we sold out
challenging.
really quickly. After how many years would you subdivide the roots? Yeah, so you really wouldn't want to subdivide plants until they have begun to clonally reproduce. So that's not going to happen until, well, so like, let's say that you purchase ramps from Rural Action. We're often selling mature ramp bulbs that are already 5+ years old. And so it may be that in, you know, within a few years, those ramps that you plant could be beginning to clonally reproduce. And so You can usually tell, like in those pictures, those dense clumps of plants. Like when you see that, that's telling you that you've got multiple bulbs in a dense area. And whether those are individual plants that are packed in really tight, or they're individual plants that have subdivided and there's two roots kind of attached, either way, when you see a dense clump like that, you can go in, harvest some, subdivide them if you need to, pull some out, and spread that clump around and give everybody a little more room to breathe. So I would base it more on what you're seeing on the ground, and if you're seeing the density of plants, than to worry about how many years it's been. Usually you can use your eyes to sort of see that they're ready. Alrighty. Can you harvest some of the greens and not hurt the bulb? Yes, we talked about that. What percentage of germination is typical of a good or successful planting? I have some experiences with that, but Andrea, do you have thoughts off the top of your head?
I would say this is probably in reference to seed as opposed to bulbs. In my experience, ramp seeds are incredibly successful. I don't have any concrete percentages, but whenever I've planted them from seed, I've always considered it great germination, highly successful. Karam, do you know of an exact percentage?
Well, I wouldn't say an exact percentage, but I will say that project that I did along with a colleague, Tanner Filya, now like probably 2015, we estimated at a planting site where we broadcast seeded a bunch of ramp seed. We estimated that we got 90% germination from that seed. So that wasn't highly scientific, but it was, we have pictures somewhere of just like a carpet of ramp seedlings. That being said, I've also heard like people that have planted seed and had, 0% germinate. But I think what Andrea and I are both saying is that we've seen it, seen ramp seed be very successful. I would say that if you planted a bunch of ramp seed, like you went out, you harvested one season, you planted it somewhere and didn't have success, I wouldn't, there's a lot of factors that could be responsible for that. It could be that year's seed crop. It could be a dry spell at the wrong time. And so I wouldn't like give up on ramp seed if it doesn't work for you once on a site that otherwise seems like it should be good. It can be really successful.
Well, and remember too, when we're talking about choosing, a good site for ramps, when we're talking about site suitability, plants might survive in a marginal site, but they're probably going to fail to thrive. So, if the ramp seed, you're planting it in a marginal site, it doesn't do well, just try again, maybe somewhere else or somewhere else in a similar vicinity of that site. We always recommend folks do what's called test plantings. So planting stock is really expensive. And even though you are farming in the shade, you're still farming and it's hard work. So you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, so to speak. If you've got a site that looks really good on paper or really good when you're out there, just do some test plots, do some test sites, and just put a little bit of seed here, a few bulbs here, and see what does well. You can monitor it for a couple years and then determine the site suitability from there.
Yeah. All right. Let's see if we can fly through a few more of these questions because there's more coming in. Any idea about the gray circles that can appear on ramps that look like a powdery mildew? I can't tell if that's the disease you were referencing. So powdery mildew. Andrea, do you have experience with this on ramps?
I've never seen powdery mildew on ramps. Yeah, I've never seen powdery mildew on ramps.
I haven't either. So actually, this was Celeste, and if our emails were in there,
I can send you, Karam.
That would be great. I'd be really
Yeah.
curious to see.
It's from Northeast Ohio, but I'm sure I have photos from last year.
That would be great.
Okay.
Yeah, send those our way. I'd love to look at them too.
We'll do a little digging into it, and if we can't figure it out, then we have some ramp colleagues that could.
We know
help us.
someone. We know someone.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. Awesome. All right. Let's see. Can ramps be grown similar to green onions? Yeah, that's a good question. Andrea, do you have thoughts on this?
I don't know, but that's a really great question. And I kind of want to experiment.
Take it for a spin. What I will say is they've there's been research on like how much of the root, okay, so you can picture the ramp bulb, and at the bottom of that bulb, there's a part, the portion of the bulb where the fine roots are growing out of is called the basal plate. And, that's like, you're not going to get, that's like where those fine roots are growing from. And that's also where the bulb is basically being generated from. So there's been research that's looked at like how far down could you cut the bulb above that basal plate and then replant the basal plate with the fine roots and have the plant regrow. So this is not exactly what you're talking about, I don't think, but they found that you have to leave about a third of the bulb on, and that that's because of energy storage, and then the plant can regrow. So that's a way to harvest the plant, and then you're kind of replanting it's not exactly a cutting, but it's another strategy. So I don't know. If you feel like experimenting and letting us know, please do. Here's a question about the recording. Will there be access later to the presentation? Well, in the recording, you'll be able to see us clicking through the slides. So it should be both the talking and the slides, and we will make that available. Okay. Let's see. I think that might be everything. Okay, wait, how does black walnut affect ramps? So yeah, that's a common kind of question around black walnut. We get it a lot because of what it will do in people's gardens. But when it comes to forest herbs, we don't find that there's any negative effect of black walnut on the growth of understory plants like ramps or ginseng, golden seal. And in fact, in a forest environment, black walnut is typically a good indication that you've got high levels of soil calcium present. It's just a tree species that likes those extra nutritious sites. And so I've heard a ginseng digger that I know who said, go right for the black walnut if you're looking for wild ginseng. So counterintuitive, but it's not anything to worry about in my experience. I don't know if you have any other perspective on that, Andrea, but
I think, yeah, when we think of coevolution with, native understory species and native overstory species, the jugalone that the roots of walnut emit don't necessarily seem to bother plants that are typically found growing in the same environment. However, if a walnut comes up in your garden, your lettuce probably won't grow, your tomatoes won't grow. These plants don't have any co-evolved mechanisms to maybe potentially deal with the jugalone. I have seen it inhibit the growth of some native plants, but not in a forested setting. So let's say you're growing passion flower in your garden and there was a walnut that came up right next to it. It could inhibit the growth of the passion flower, but they're not typically found growing in association with one another. So even though both species are native, there may not be any coevolution factor at play. Yeah, walnut is really good indicator of deep, rich soil. And I love seeing it in the woods, especially large walnuts. I feel like I don't see large walnuts in the woods very often because they have a high timber value. So it's always good to see walnut in the woods, especially big ones.
I had a question. When I have seeds in my in my plants, should I just let them drop off on their own, or is it better to pick them and then plant them?
yeah, well, I mean, you can do either one. And if you want to let nature do the work for you, that's fine. And some of those seeds will germinate. But if you went out and collected them, the advantages there are that you can move those seeds to wherever you want. So if you want to actually expand your population around the edges, that's a way to do that. You can go put those seeds exactly where you want them. And then the other thing is, if you're going and actually pulling the leaf litter back, using your rake to scrape up the soil surface a little bit, you're giving those seeds a head start, and you're going to probably get better germination rates. So no harm in letting them fall on their own, but you can help move things along a little faster if you collect them and replant them. Okay, well, anything else, Carlene?
Hi, guys. Thank you, Karen. That was, and all the information you guys give is just outstanding. So thanks so much. I'm taking lots of notes, but I have two questions for you. To what degree is leaf and bulb size related? You know, I'm surprised sometimes when I dig them up to be really tall leaves and little bulbs. And Andrea, do you have any experience in that from what you've grown?
I don't necessarily know that there is any sort of relationship between bulb size and leaf size. Yeah, not that I've ever seen. Karen?
Well, yeah, that's interesting. We were actually just talking about this the other day. We were talking about ginseng and golden seal because it's something that researchers like to do, is to figure out, like, to actually figure out what that specific relationship is between leaf size and root size. And that's different for every species. And they develop these equations that let you do that relationship. So for ginseng, there is a relationship. And so researchers will go and actually measure the leaf. And it's a way to do non-destructive sampling of that plant to be able to tell how fast it's growing using the leaf as a proxy measurement. With ramps, I don't know of any similar relationship that's been established, but I will say, going back to this idea that the bulbs are changing so much in a given season, that it may just be like within one plant, if you dug that root at the very beginning of April versus the end of May, the bulb is going to be a very different size. And so big leaves, it's more photosynthetic machinery to provide that plant with energy. There's a relationship. It's just what my gut is telling me. But maybe more important for the size of the bulb is the season that you're digging up the plant. That's what's really, you're gonna see the biggest changes in the bulb size.
Okay,
That's
great. Thanks. Yeah,
I'll
I'll make a note of that as I harvest. The other question I had is, do you have any experience, trimming the tips of the roots when you transplant fingerlings, or soaking them in, like, if it's going to be a day, maybe just soaking them in water before you transplant?
I've never soaked them in water. Typically, when you buy ramp bulbs, they should still have some dirt on them. So they shouldn't be, typically when you're selling planting stock, ramp bulbs, typically they should have some dirt on them. They shouldn't be completely clean, as though you're going to sell them at like a farmer's market. I think that dirt helps insulate them, hold in some of that moisture, because there's going to be moisture in that dirt. I've personally never soaked them. And then the other question, trimming the fibrous roots?
The tips of the roots.
tips?
I mean, with a lot of plants, that's advisable to generate some more robust growth. I just wondered if you'd had experience with that.
I don't have any experience with that. Karam, do you?
No, I haven't come across anyone that's done that and said that it's, I mean, we usually have really high transplant success with ramps. So I feel like they're not a very finicky plant compared to others. And so, but I mean, it'd be pretty interesting if you want to set up a little test area where you transplant, and trim the root on one and don't on the other. That'd be pretty cool to see if that helps. I don't know though.
Glad to hear they're not finicky.
They're not.
Yeah,
The supply is so limited.
Right. I know. Well, that's the thing. It's like, that there's I think a lot of potential, even though it's slow growing, to do a lot with ramps, to move them around, to help them out, help them do their thing. Like they respond really well to being transplanted. So if we could just get everybody to do a little bit of tending, I think ramps would have a brighter future.
And so would we, because we would all be laden with ramps.
Okay, I'm not sure I understand this question that Alia posted in the chat. Does leaf size indicate it with other alliums? Maybe if I'm understanding that correctly, or Alia, you want to just clarify that question for us?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay.
When the discussion was on the leaf size, does it indicate a larger ramp? Well, when you're growing like garlic or onions, does it indicate that? I was just wondering if there was a correlation.
Got it. Okay, so like in other alliums, does that leaf size indicate a larger? Yeah. Well, that's a good question. I think just as a general rule of thumb, a larger leaf is indicative of a larger plant and a plant with more energy. I mean, you think about what goes into creating a leaf, it's energy, it's stored energy. So I think as a general rule of thumb, yes. But as far as getting really specific with it, there's other factors that go into. It's like one thing that you'll see. So like oak trees do this really dramatically, where the leaves up at the top of the tree that are getting the most sunlight are actually the smallest leaves. And the leaves that are lowest on the tree that are in partial shade are the largest. And so that's a plant responding to the sunlight conditions to make a bigger leaf to try to capture more sun in a shadier environment. And there's some indications that golden seal does the same thing. And so leaf size is actually a response to multiple different things, and every species is doing, a slightly different, responding to a slightly different set of conditions in slightly different ways. So that's why I say it's a little hard. It's a very species specific thing, but just I think as a rule of thumb, if you see a big healthy leaf, you can usually say, okay, that's a healthy, happy plant. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, if there are and they come up later, please email us. Happy to respond that way.